I would like to introduce Dr. Ian Saldanha next, or after his talk, you will call him Mr. Outcome. Dr. Saldanha is an assistant professor of health services, policy and practice, and also of epidemiology at the Brown University School of Public Health. He is the assistant director of the Brown Evidence-based Practice Center, which is supported by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Dr. Saldanha's research interests broadly include the use of outcomes, core outcome sets, and technology for systematic reviews. And today, he's going to discuss problems and solutions associated with outcome inconsistency in systematic reviews. Over to you, Dr. Saldanha.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and good greetings to everybody. It's fantastic to be here with you. I will be talking about, as Tanjing said, I'll be tackling the issue of complexity and outcomes, specifically about the issue of inconsistency and discussing some of the problems and laying out some potential solutions. I want to start with my takeaway points, which is that I believe we as an evidence synthesis community need to do more to address the problems that I'm going to describe. That's the outcome inconsistency problem specifically. Efforts are underway, and I think we need to capitalize on them, and I think we need to contribute to them more than we have. I'll start by posing this question, and if you can take a moment and think to yourself, why don't we just use our own outcomes of interest in the systematic reviews that we do? What are the problems with that? Let me show you some data suggesting that that is a problem. So this is from a few years ago now, where we looked at the Cochrane Eyes and Vision reviews, systematic reviews that address the four most common ocular conditions: age-related macular degeneration, cataract, diabetic retinopathy, and glaucoma. And essentially what you're looking at here are four plots where for each of these conditions, we plotted the percentage of trials that reported each specific outcome with the percentage of systematic reviews. That's these Cochrane reviews that include the trials that reported the same outcome. So in an ideal world, if there was strong agreement between outcomes in trials and outcomes in systematic reviews, you'll see a lot of outcomes populated in this top right quadrant. But instead, what you see, what I hope you appreciate across here in this sample, is that most of the outcomes, individual outcomes, are in the bottom left quadrant, suggesting not as much agreement as we would like between trialists and systematic reviewers in the outcomes that are considered important. We did a similar piece of work in HIV/AIDS, looking at all the systematic reviews that were addressing the topic of HIV/AIDS. We split them out by different types of interventions, such as clinical management, behavioral prevention, biomedical prevention, and health services. And essentially, you see a similar story, a preponderance of the outcomes in the lower left quadrant of each of these plots. Around the same time as when we were doing this work, Dr. Evan Mayo Wilson and colleagues at Johns Hopkins were doing this major study that was a major project that was the multiple data sources project, where they were trying to see what is the impact of multiple data sources on the results of our systematic reviews. They did a methodological exploration into one particular systematic review, which was looking at gabapentin for neuropathic pain. They found 21 trials that addressed the topic, and there were four main outcome domains that we were interested in, which were pain intensity, quality of life, sleep disturbance, and mood. So these are four outcomes that they were interested in. But I want to remind you that an outcome is not just the domain it represents. Pain, for example, can be measured using the McGill Pain Questionnaire and a host of other measurement instruments. It can be analyzed in multiple ways, aggregated in multiple ways in each group, and various time points and so on. So once they took a deeper dive into those four outcome domains, there was an explosion of results. Four outcome domains, but 214 different outcomes when you consider those different things about how the pain was measured, how it was analyzed, when it was measured, and when it was reported, and so on. And this led to even more, way more unique results. Look at the multiplicity that we can deal with in our systematic reviews. In addition to the multiplicity, the problem that presents itself when we do our systematic reviews is sort of illustrated here. So what you're looking at here is more recently, we looked at all Cochrane Eyes and Vision reviews. The earlier data I showed you were just for 4 conditions. These are all 125 systematic reviews that were under the purview of the Cochrane Eyes and Vision group. So they are laid out on the x-axis here. The y-axis is what proportion of each one of the reviews, what proportion of the studies in each one of the reviews made it into a meta-analysis in the review, in any outcome of the review. That's what the blue curve is. And the red bars within each are specifically for the primary outcomes. But let's focus on the blue curve. What you see here is that for about a third of the reviews that under the Cochrane Eyes and Vision group's purview, all the studies that were included into the review made it into the meta-analysis, which is great. But then you see a rather steep drop-off, where for about 40% of the reviews, or 39% specifically, not all the trials, or quite a small percentage as you drop down later on, of the trials and the reviews made it into the meta-analyses. And for about a quarter of the reviews on the right, no trials made it into meta-analyses, or in other words, they couldn't conduct meta-analyses. So if you're trying to conduct meta-analyses using data that we include in our reviews, we tend to struggle with loss of information with the outcomes that we choose. So more recently, we conducted a piece of work where we looked at the first 100 Cochrane reviews. It was a convenient sample of the first 100 Cochrane reviews of 2019. And we asked the question, to what extent are systematic reviewers as a community recognizing the problem? So 40% of these Cochrane reviews identified somewhere in the review, there were problems with outcome inconsistency, which came in the way of them doing either meta-analyses or summarizing the results in some other way. And that's quite a big chunk of the reviews, at least this sample of the reviews that we looked at. Why is outcome inconsistency a problem? Late last year, Holger Schoenemann and colleagues came out with a very elegant paper where they described the standardized outcomes linking across solar stakeholder system, elegantly acronymized to SOLAR system, which I really like, where they lay out and say that at the center of the system needs to be the patient-important outcomes, the people for whom the interventions are designed. We need to focus our outcomes on them. And then the various parts of the rest of the planets in the solar system, if you would, are the various research or other endeavors, such as randomized trials, systematic reviews, health technology assessments, guidelines, quality improvement initiatives, clinical policy, clinical care, and so on. Now, sort of the distance between each of these sort of planets and the sun there reflects how close the authors conceptualize the outcomes are to the ideal patient-centered outcomes. So with that in mind, we need to be cognizant as a systematic review community, and others in the rest of this community need to be cognizant that the outcomes we pick, after all, make it down into the rest of this ecosystem. So we need to think a lot about the fact that we need to measure the right outcomes and measure, as is illustrated here, the outcomes that matter to the people for whom we are evaluating interventions. That's the patients. Let me come back to the data I started with, which was those 4 eye conditions. I present to you and I'd posit to you that this really would not have been a problem had we had a set of outcomes in the top right in each of these figures. If there was a set of outcomes that each of the trials and reviews are measuring, then it doesn't really matter if trials and reviewers are measuring additional things. I mean, there are so many different things that are relevant to a specific context, but why not have a set of outcomes that everyone agrees on? And that's exactly what I want to draw your attention to, the notion of core outcome sets. These are agreed upon minimum sets of outcomes that should be measured and reported within specific disease areas. Now, the key word here is minimum. No one's saying that you should only measure these. It's at least let's measure these and develop some standardization around them. So it has been recommended that these core outcome set should include patient-important outcomes as well as outcomes that are quote-unquote more clinically relevant that may not necessarily be patient-important. And that the advantages, the main advantages are sort of threefold in core outcome sets. The obvious one is that there's outcome standardization that they could promote. The other is to ensure that we can compare the results across studies in our reviews and combine studies into meta-analyses. And we can, for the outcomes that are in the core outcome set at least, if the core outcome set is adopted more widely in the community, to help prevent outcome reporting bias. Because if trials know that they need to report a certain outcome, they're much less, or they must report an outcome in a core outcome set, they're much less likely to be biased in how they report the outcome, or if they report the outcome at all. So how are these developed, if you're curious? They're typically done for clinical trials, but they can be done for clinical practice or for both. The involvement of individuals in this process usually includes healthcare professionals, patients, researchers, and others, so multi-stakeholder involvement. And there's generally a two-step process that's followed. First is identifying candidate outcomes through a review or a survey or some other method. And once a candidate list is developed, then consensus is generated to identify what should be measured, and for the ones that are decided upon, how they should be measured. So across topic areas, there are a lot of core outcome sets that are available now in the 400 range. And you can see here, though, that there's quite a bit of spread or variability across clinical areas. So cancer and rheumatology, for example, at the left, you can see quite a lot of outcomes. And urology and mental health, I guess, much fewer, and then way fewer the ones on the right here. You should ignore the colors here. The colors within the bars just represent the updates of the systematic review that was conducted to find these existing core outcome sets. Just FYI, these core outcome sets are searchable via the COMET database at that website. So in that piece of work where I described, where we looked at the 100 Cochrane reviews of 2000, the first 100 in 2019, where we noted the problems and outcomes, we also looked into to what extent did these researchers mention core outcome sets. So these are Cochrane reviewers. To what extent are they using core outcome sets already when choosing outcomes? And that was 7%. Among the remaining 93%, we looked in the COMET database to find whether there was a relevant core outcome set. And for about 29% of those, there was a relevant core outcome set that could have been used. So as part of the same work, we also conducted a survey of Cochrane review group editors. So of the approximately 50 Cochrane review groups, 32 review group editors participated. And there was quite common agreement that use of core outcome sets would be advantageous for systematic reviews. But the main challenge that was recognized was how to assess the scope of an existing core outcome set to the topic of the review that is being conducted. And if you think about it, actually comparing scope is kind of complicated. You can't necessarily just grab a core outcome set off the shelf and apply it to the topic of the systematic review. They are generally determined for specific patient populations or group of populations and conditions, and offer specific interventions that are designed to tackle that patient condition. Now, keeping that in mind, we ask ourselves, so what if we developed a framework to guide the community in applying a given core outcome set to a given systematic review? And what would that framework look like? So we started with the population. If you think about a core outcome set population, it could be either narrower than a systematic review that you're working on. It could be an exact match, which is great. It could be broader, which may also be great. Or it may be a different population subgroup. So a different population subgroup might mean children versus adults with a given condition. Similarly, if you think about the intervention, you can do the exact same thing. The core outcome set could be narrower than the systematic review. It could be an exact match. It could be broader, or it could be a different but a related intervention. And I'll come back to that idea a little later. So if you look at these four possibilities for both population and intervention, what happens is you have a matrix of 16 possible scenarios that can occur based on these. We generally, as I'll talk a little later, for each of these, it's important to to involve the clinicians in determining whether the core outcome set is relevant to the systematic review, but particularly so in the bottom row here, which is a different population subgroup. If it is a children versus adults, maybe younger adults versus older adults, and so on. So for each of these scenarios, we then discussed as a group, we discussed in a few online webinars with a range of audiences, where we said which of these scenarios are more likely to generally mean that the core outcome set is either very likely to be relevant. Those are represented in the yellow here. The orange are those that the core outcome set may be relevant, so there's a lesser degree of certainty there. Or the ones on the right, where it's a different but related interventions, we generally landed on the core outcome set is unlikely to be relevant. Now, generally, we went with the notion that if the core outcome set is either an exact match or broader than the systematic review, so at least as broad as the systematic review, both in terms of the population and in terms of the intervention, we landed on that it's very likely that the core outcome set is to be relevant. Now, very likely, we are not saying that you have to, this is the core outcome set, you have to use it. There are other considerations, of course, but it's just a measure of likelihood. The situations around it, at least the ones, except the ones on the right, are the ones where it may be relevant, and the ones on the right where it's a different but related intervention, we said the core outcome set is unlikely to be relevant. So that was a sort of a theoretical development of the framework. We then said, okay, let's empirically test this out. So we conducted a study recently of from the last 3 years, the systematic reviews that were published by evidence-based practice centers, that's what EPCs are, that are funded by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is the same agency that's sponsoring this, that's funding this series of symposia. So we looked at, so this is a major funder of systematic reviews in the United States. So we looked at all 67 reviews in the last 3 years that have been published by them. It turned out that more than half of these reviews have a relevant core outcome sets when we looked in the COMET database. So 54% of these 67 reviews, and these were matched to 62 core outcome sets. And the reason why it's not a one-to-one match, as you might imagine, is that a given systematic review topic you may have multiple core outcome sets that are related to that topic, and vice versa. And it shook out that once we looked at these individual pairs of reviews and core outcome sets, there were 80 such pairs. Now, how did these 80 pairs shake out using the framework that we just looked at? So out of those 80 pairs, it turned out that if all the yellow cells get added up here, 51 of those 80 pairs, our assessment based on this framework was that the core outcome set is very likely to be relevant. For 17 of the 80 pairs, it may be relevant. And for the remaining 12, it's unlikely to be relevant, but we didn't want to dismiss it because the interventions were reasonably related, but not completely similar, but we were quite hesitant, so we put them in the unlikely to be relevant bucket. How did the outcomes compare? So what I talked about so far in that framework was a lot about the scope of the core outcome set. How did the individual outcomes in the systematic reviews and the core outcome sets, the individual matches, how did those outcomes compare? It turned out that out of every 100, let me not say 100. So 40% of the systematic review outcomes that were included in the systematic review were also in the core outcome sets, and that interquartile range was 23 to 56%. Now, these were either exact matches, such as mortality, or they were partial matches, where one outcome was partially related to the other, but we couldn't say for sure whether it was an exact match. But put together, these were 40% of outcomes. So 40% of the outcomes in our systematic reviews are in corresponding core outcome sets. So let me begin to wrap up here and summarize some of the data that I've showed you. As I mentioned, we developed a framework, and the intention is to guide systematic reviewers in gauging the relevance of a given core outcome set to the topic. So our intention is to guide, obviously not to, it's not intended by any means to be that if there's a core outcome set, you have to use it, but this is just a framework to help guide that decision making. And approximately a third to a half, depending on whether you looked at the Cochrane reviews or the AHRQ reviews that I showed you, have relevant core outcome sets. And when you look at the outcomes, approximately 40% of the outcomes in our reviews are in corresponding core outcome sets. And to us, it suggests that we can, when we are starting to think about outcome choice for our systematic reviews, looking at existing core outcome sets could provide a great starting point. And in the community, though, there's increasing recognition of the importance of core outcome sets. So on the COMET website, there is, if you go to this link down at the bottom, there's a whole list of these various sort of stakeholders who have endorsed core outcome sets. So trial funders in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere have endorsed core outcome sets, meaning that when they're in their funding announcements, they have announced that when choosing outcomes for the trial, look at the COMET database for existing core outcome sets. Systematic reviews, here Cochrane is ahead of the others, where as you can see here in chapter 3 of the Cochrane Handbook, the current version of the Cochrane Handbook, in one of the methodological expectations for the conduct of intervention reviews, that's what MESIR is here. The box says where available, established sets of core outcomes should be used, and then it goes on to talk about patient-reported outcomes. So a couple of closing thoughts. I don't think core outcome sets by any means can solve all complexity outcomes related to complexity issues related to outcomes, but opportunities abound. There's no obvious reason that us collaborators and others could think of as to why a given core outcome set should not be relevant to a systematic review. When we are doing our systematic reviews, we should consider them as a starting point when we decide on outcomes. The COMET database is a very, very helpful resource in this regard. And potentially we could use the few outcomes that are in the core outcomes as key outcomes for our summary of findings tables. But of course, we need to make decisions with our stakeholders when deciding on that for our systematic reviews. And I think we should be more involved with their development, because if you think back to that ecosystem that I showed you, if the core outcome, if the trials are going to make it into our reviews, and if we want the trials to measure things that we care about, we need to feed into the process of core outcome set generation and development, so that eventually when the trials measure those core outcomes, they reflect the priorities of us in the evidence synthesis community, and of course others in that ecosystem as well. And therefore we have leverage that I think we should capitalize on. So I just want to come back to my takeaway points and repeat them. I think we need to do more to address the outcome complexity problem. Efforts are underway. Let's capitalize on them. Let's contribute to them. And with that, I'd like to wrap up here and thank the symposium organizers, especially Dr. Tianjing Li, for inviting me, and collaborators for many brilliant ideas and collaborations that have helped a lot of this work happen. And right now to all of you for your attention. And that's my contact information at the bottom. Feel free to reach out. Thank you.